So, Scott Marsh is from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. He comes from Michigan with a background in forestry and wildlife management. He previously worked for the Michigan Department of Agriculture as a nursery inspector and the Nevada Department of Agriculture as a noxious weed program coordinator before coming to Kansas as a state weed specialist in January. So just 1 month then, huh?
3 weeks.
3 weeks, okay. And today he's going to talk about invasive horticultural plants for small landscapes. Welcome, Scott.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Like she said, it's been 3 weeks, so please, please keep that in mind as I go through this. I'm talking today about invasive horticultural plants. I deal mostly with noxious weeds, but also with invasive weeds and invasive plants. But to get into it, what is a weed? There really is no set definition of a weed. A plant out of place, plant growing where you don't want it, where it's not valued, in disturbed, all kinds of different definitions, none of them official. One I like best is an older one from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Weed is a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. And so, what is a weed? Could be just about anything. A corn plant in a cornfield is certainly not a weed, but if it's growing in the middle of the 18th green on your favorite golf course, it would be a weed. Invasive, what's invasive? This actually has a definition developed by President Clinton back in '99 when he put together invasive species executive order. Find it as an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. This is actually pretty close to the noxious weed definition that a lot of states use, but for now it's the invasive species. The executive order also talked about introduction or the introduction of invasive species as being intentional or unintentional release of these species, but it could be a seed you pick up on your shoe as you're walking along one place and it dropping off somewhere else. That would be part of the introduction. This executive order also created the National Invasive Species Council that is very active today in helping to spread information throughout the country about invasives, what species are invasive and how to control them, and how to avoid spreading or introducing them. And then noxious weed. Again, I touched on that. It's pretty close to the previous one, but this one is in federal law. And most states have a state law that define what a noxious weed is. This one, like I say, it's pretty close. Directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, livestock, other interests, and just about everything that, again, can cause harm or detrimental to the environment, dangerous, such as poisonous plants. In Kansas, we have a little bit different definition. In Kansas, it merely defines noxious weeds as the weeds that are listed as noxious. So we don't have, can't describe a noxious weed by law in Kansas, but I can tell you which ones are. And where they are. They're in Chapter 2 of Article 13 of Chapter 2 of the state law. It's where this definition was that I just showed you. And the administrative regulations, kind of tell us how to enforce the laws that are written, and tells you how we're going to do it. So it's law says what's illegal, and regulations say how it will be enforced. We also have weed control plans for every one of those noxious weeds that was on the previous list. We have a written control plan that tells you the best ways to go about controlling those weeds, whether it be mechanically, whether you can dig them up or not, or pull them, culturally, provide competition for the noxious weeds versus just leaving an exposed disturbed soil area. And then there's also the chemical application of herbicides to kill the plant. There's also biological. Many species have biological control agents, which are usually insects, but could also be pathogens or other plants or just different things that will not necessarily kill the noxious weeds, but slow down the growth and reproduction of those weeds so that they don't spread as fast, and it stresses them out so that they can be controlled easier with other methods. Putting all those together, we call it integrated weed management, and is the best way as a whole to control most weeds. Characteristics of invasive weed. Early maturation. It starts growing and flowering earlier in the year than the other species. So it gets the attention of the bees and the birds and the moths and the pollinators sooner. And so they're more active with these plants when the other ones start flowering. They also produce seeds earlier, so they get down to the ground quicker and can start taking up more of the nutrients and water. Produce a lot of seeds. There are some invasive species that produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per plant and are easily disseminated. Aggressive vegetative reproduction. This means reproducing from things other than seed. Such as the root system, various types of root systems. There's a species that I used to work with called perennial pepperweed. The root had buds on it about every inch for most of the length of the bud. If you dug up that plant, and the root would be 20 to 30 feet deep, if you dug up that plant and didn't get it all, the roots at the top of what was left would start growing, and where you had one plant, you would end up with 5 or 6 plants. And so that's a very common method of reproduction for perennial plants. The species that do reproduce heavily vegetatively often do not produce very well through seeds. They may produce a lot of seeds, but the germination rate may not be very high. The worst ones are when they do both. Long seed dormancy. Excuse me, a lot of times they'll release a lot of seeds, and a lot of those seeds will just lay in the soil and eventually get buried down into the soil and will just lay there dormant for years. There's an experiment in Michigan State. A professor took a bunch of seeds and put them in glass jars and buried them. And they're digging some of them up 100 years later and finding that they're still viable. And so this can be one of those issues. If you turn the soil over, those seeds that have been buried come back to the light and they start germinating again. We call it a seed bank in the soil, which is a major problem. You can kill off all of the plants that are growing there and think you've done a great job and gotten rid of these plants, but the next year there are just as many plants growing there as you thought you had killed. Well, you had killed them, it's just the seeds that were laying dormant germinated because a lot more light started getting to the soil. Adapted to spread with crop seeds. They time their maturation with the crop's maturation. And so when you harvest the crop, the seeds of the crop, you're also harvesting the seeds of the plant. And if your crop is for seed, well, your seed is infested with the seeds of a noxious weed. And that's a major cause of spread for noxious weeds, at least in the past it has been. Ability to parasitize other plants. A plant called dodder is a parasitic plant. And where you have it, it will just cover over whatever plant it has infested and will spread just from plant to plant. Doesn't need to produce any seed. Roots and rhizomes with a lot of reserves. Those plants, those perennial plants with big roots will, if you cut them off, they can't photosynthesize anymore because you've cut off the leaves. Well, they use the energy down in the roots to start growing again. And if you cut it off, they still have energy to come back. And you can keep doing that, and it's just going to keep coming back because of the large amount of reserves that are in the soil. These are also the plants that usually grow earliest in the spring because they don't have to try and accumulate new reserves. High photosynthetic rates. Plants can survive in the shade underneath other plants. So the seeds get dispersed in under a stand of trees. They can still grow and grow effectively because they can photosynthesize very well. They don't need the direct sunlight that a lot of native plants do. Very competitive versus to the native ones. No natural controls. We're pretty good at bringing plants in from other countries. We're not as good at bringing the insects that eat them in their native lands, or the pathogens, or the animals or birds. And those that we do bring in turn out to find a lot of our natives to be rather tasty. But without their natural control, they'll just keep reproducing and reproducing. A lot of our species, our native species, you take them to an area without any of the bugs they developed with, will take off because they have the same reproduction rate, but nothing is killing them off, so they thrive. Where just here, they're kept in balance because of those enemies. And they can form monocultures, just solid mats of the same species that shade out other species and outcompete with them with deeper roots or broader leaves, better photosynthetic rates. And the species underneath, if a native species seed got underneath that, there just wouldn't be enough sun or enough nutrients or enough room to take root. So they just get crowded out. How do they get introduced, these invasive species? A lot of different ways. Naturally, get blown in by the wind, float on the water. You can think of the volcanic islands in the Pacific, no connection to anything, and yet they have a bunch of vegetation on them. This is because they just naturally came in. And that still causes them to spread in the United States, but it's not really as much how they get introduced. Get introduced anthropogenically, by man. We introduce these through nursery stock. There's a field-grown forsythia with a Canada thistle seedling growing out of it. Sell that to a homeowner, lives 50 miles away in an area that hasn't had Canada thistle, you got a whole new population. Like that moved in the soil with these nursery stock. Contaminants in aquatic plants. Most of our aquatic invasives were introduced through the aquarium trade. They, nobody really cared whether they're invasive or not because you're going to keep them in this little glass jar or a glass tank. Well, people their fish die, they get bored with their fish, they dump it in the ditch. That stuff, after, rains, it gets carried down the ditch to the nearest creek, and from there it just keeps spreading. That has been documented in many cases as a way. And plant collectors, you find something really exotic, really beautiful, you've never seen before, you want to take it home and plant it. Everybody wants that. A lot of flowers, big, beautiful flowers. Well, you got to take the time to think about it before you bring something like that in. First of all, you won't be able to. They'll stop you at the border. but there's always those cases where it slips through the cracks. Some more movements. Another big one historically is contaminated agricultural seed. I guess I talked about that earlier. Many of our agricultural weeds were introduced this way. They brought wheat seed over from Europe. It had some of these weed seeds in it. Now the weed seeds are here. Johnson grass. I'm sure everybody's heard of Johnson grass. That was introduced intentionally. Guy named Johnson, believe it or not, brought it over thinking it'd make great forage. Well, got a little too big for forage and spread a little too quickly. Equipment. I don't know if you can see here, the truck with a noxious weed slammed in the door. I had stopped in the field of the stuff, opened the door, got back in, shut the door, and grabbed the weed without knowing it. And who knows how far he's going to carry that before it drops off. Contaminated equipment, getting seeds stuck on your tires. It can even happen you drive through a mud hole and the mud splashes onto your vehicle. That mud could have had a bunch of seed laying on it from earlier dispersal. You go home, wash it off, you've spread it. And of course, international commerce is the reason it's spreading. Things are spreading right now. A lot of things are being introduced unintentionally because of the nursery trade, because of other things. Emerald ash borer, I'm sure you guys have heard of that. That was brought into Detroit on a pallet. The pallet was made of an ash equivalent in China. It still had some bark on it. There was a borer inside that bark. It was brought to America on a pallet, and the rest is history. And of course, international travel. You're over in Europe, you walk through a field, you get some seeds on your shoe. Customs doesn't look at that kind of stuff. You get back, it falls off, there's an reintroduction. The armed services, they're going internationally all the time. Who knows what they're bringing back? Okay, now to give some examples of invasive species that we are concerned of in Kansas that are common in the horticultural trade. First one is a couple of names, Kogan grass, also known as Japanese blood grass. Really nice looking ornamental grass. Grows by, or spreads through rhizomous roots very effectively. Look how many new plants are growing off of that one short section of root. It can take over, spread rapidly, and it can withstand drought, so it doesn't need to stay in an irrigated lawn. It can get out from there into fields and pastures. Cultivars, somebody will tell you that this is a cultivar, it's infertile, so you don't have to worry about it. Well, oops. With this, it doesn't have to be fertile. It doesn't have to have any seeds. But they can always revert. They reproduce a couple of times, sometimes more than that, and suddenly they're producing viable seed. It happens all the time. So it's something you really have to be careful of. This one is on the federal noxious weed list. One of about 72 terrestrial plants on the noxious weed or federal noxious weed list. So that means they're worried about it at a federal level. And this can be the result of the introduction of Kogan grass. English ivy. Everybody has seen pictures of the old English manor house with ivy on the walls. Looks very rustic, old time. These vines can grow to 100 feet in length, given time and the conditions. Native to Eurasia. When in doubt, tell people it's native to Eurasia. That covers about 3/4 of the globe. It can spread. It likes moisture areas, but does not recognize garden boundaries or property boundaries or state boundaries. And it can climb up into trees, shade them out directly. This also is from England, where English ivy you'd think it'd be there. That can be the result. And the ivy growing on the side of a house sends little hairs into the brick and mortar and can break that down, causing damage to the house as well as being invasive. Bohemian knotweed, one of several knotweeds that a lot of people are very scared of. Very tall, thick growing, nice yellow flowers. Nobody said noxious weeds are ugly. Some noxious weeds can be very beautiful. Rhizotomous, so it doesn't need to produce a lot of seed. Doesn't need to produce any seed. Grow to 8 feet tall. It reproduces from Japanese knotweed and giant knotweed. It's a hybrid of those two. Both Japanese knotweed is also listed noxious in several parts of the country. I haven't seen giant on them, but you take noxious and noxious, you get pretty noxious. Grown ornamentally, they look like bamboo with the nice flowers, spikes on them, but easily escapes cultivation and can colonize large areas. It can just, again, take over, forms monoculture. How many native species do you think could get down under that and grow up through that? There's not much sun that gets through that. Showy evening primrose, beautiful plant. It's a ground cover, doesn't grow very tall. Drought resistant, again, it doesn't need irrigation. It's very aggressive in small beds. Most ground covers do spread thickly and rapidly, but they will usually stop where they're supposed to. This one doesn't. It goes where it wants to. Chameleon plant. Another short plant, native to Asia. Again, spreads vegetatively, asexually. So it doesn't need to, doesn't even need to pollinate. And again, cultivars there are many cultivars. They play with the colors and the size of the flowers and all that. A lot of times when they work to produce big, abundant flowers or large, showy leaves, the reproduction or seed production slows down because it's putting all its energy into this leaf and showy leaf and flower production. But again, with the root system growing, it doesn't need to do that. You can identify this by crushing and smelling the leaves. It smells oily, diesely. But again, can take over in the garden, and then from the garden to the yard, and from the yard to the neighbor, and so on. Gooseneck Loosestrife. This is a different genus than the purple loosestrife that I'm sure you've heard about, that is on our quarantine list. But it looks somewhat similar, so it got the same name. A similar name. Again, rhizotomous. Reproduces underground. We can't see where it's going. Native to Asia, spreads aggressively, and again can take over. And forming monocultures, eliminating wildlife habitat along stream banks, and just eliminating native species. Giant reed, the big one that I worked with in Nevada, down in the Las Vegas area, forming forests of this huge grass. But again, A lot of the same thing, grows underground, grows very fast, can grow more than 2 feet a week. And again, it's been adapted or cultivated for showy leaves. To make it attractive, you want to plant it, not realizing what's going to happen if you do. And again, it can just get carried away. Reed canary grass. This is on some noxious weed lists. Again, a lot of the same thing. Rhizotomus grows around the world, up in the northern countries. And this one spreads both by seed and rhizomes, so it's a double whammy. And again, variegated cultivars in the showy adaptations. Make it attractive. You want to put it in there and then not realizing that it can and will take over. Okay, now being a state weed specialist, I've got to put a plug in for the noxious weeds of the state. Field bindweed. Back in the mid-1800s, they realized this was going to be a problem. That was a problem back then and has not slowed down. It's one of the most widespread noxious weeds in the state. Musk thistle. This is a biannual thistle, introduced thistle. Easy to control if you've got the time. You can just dig up the plant at any time and you'll be done with it. But it also forms an extensive seed bank, so that if you don't kill them get rid of the plants right away, then you're dealing with the seeds that keep coming back up. Ceresia lespedeza. This is a new one for me. I haven't worked with it much, but it's our only woody plant on our list. Johnson grass, again, introduced as a forage. Didn't really work as a forage, but worked just as a noxious weed. This, I've been told, is one of the most widespread noxious weeds in the country. Canada thistle. Another introduced thistle, much smaller seed heads, but just as thorny. And one of the hardest of the thistles to eradicate. It's a perennial and it doesn't like to die. Leafy spurge, another widespread plant. It's noxious here, it was noxious in Nevada. So it can adapt to just about any type of environment. This one can be controlled by grazing, goat grazing especially. Kind of weird. This has a milky sap to it, and the goats don't like it. They will refuse to eat it. But if you fence them into an area with nothing but leafy spurge, they'll start to eat it because they're hungry, and then they become addicted to it, and that's all they'll eat. And they'll do a very good job of eating it and getting rid of it. Horicress, member of the mustard family, one of many, many, many members of the mustard family. Hard to control. There's no biological control agents for this because it is in the mustard family, as are broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, and a lot of other vegetables that the agricultural industry would not want to have a bug jump from one mustard plant to another. And that's the hard part, is making sure the biocontrol insects will not eat all of what they came for and then go looking for something else that's closely related. Russian knapweed. Looks a little bit like the Canada thistle I showed you, but there's no thorns on the leaves. And the flower is a bit smaller. There are 3 or 4 different knapweeds infesting this country, and each one of them have different types of bracts or modified leaves at the base of the flower. These are the plain papery looking ones. Spotted knapweed, they look spotted, and there are also diffuse square rose and meadow knapweeds. Burr ragweed, one of 2 native species on our list, because although they're native, they do tend to take over and crowd out other species. Kudzu, famous kudzu, famous to the southeast. If you've ever been down there, you know the damage it can do. It can cover things more densely than the English ivy I showed you, and grow quicker than the common reed or giant reed. Quackgrass. If you've ever talked with a farmer, I'm sure you've heard of quackgrass in negative terms, and pignut, another native. And then we also have 2 weeds that are optional, county by county. The county commissioners can decide whether or not they want them to be listed as noxious in their county or not. One is multiflora rose. This is also considered noxious up in Oregon in the Northwest. And bull thistle, another introduced thistle. These you can tell from musk thistle. They've got a spine right at the very tip of the leaf. And musk thistle, the flower head bends over at the tip, also called nodding thistle because of that. And bull thistle doesn't do that. But there are also native thistles, and there were biocontrol agents introduced way back when for these noxious thistles, but they were found to be jumping over to native thistles. So they were, the insects were discontinued, and you can't get them anymore for good reason. And we have what we call quarantine species. It's in our plant pest law rather than our weed law. Purple loosestrife, again, can take over aquatic areas, riparian areas, and crowding out not only other vegetation, but eliminating wildlife habitat along the banks, as well as recreational habitat. It's hard to bust your way through some of the stands of these things to get to the water. We are going to be introducing some biological control agents for purple loosestrife this year, or plan to if the money comes through. And a lot of states have had great success with those, and will really slow down the reproduction rate and spread. So we're hoping to have the same kind of success. Grecian foxglove. Again, this one's fairly new to me, but definitely an attractive plant, but will take over. And salt cedar is more of a problem in the western part of the state than the east. These will take over habitat usually used by willows and cottonwoods. And these plants have extensive root systems, and one of the things the root system does is it will collect salts, mineral salts from deep down in the soil, bring them up into the leaves of the plant, and when the leaves of the plant fall off during the fall and decompose in the ground, that salt is now at the surface, restricting the amount of other plants that can grow underneath and around them. And they can use a mature plant. One of these can use up to 300 gallons of water a year. So if you're trying to grow something else, you don't want these, because what you'll have is be dry. And then we have the watch list called our early detection rapid response list. As you can see up here, if you've seen any of these, please contact Kansas Department of Agriculture. We need to know about these. Some of them are in Kansas already, but not very widespread. We want to make sure they don't spread anymore. But a lot of them are not in Kansas, and we need to know right away if they are ever found here, because we need to jump on them as soon as possible. Some of these you'll remember from earlier in the talk that are on the federal noxious weed list, on our quarantine list. Hydrilla is also on the federal noxious weed list. It is one of those aquatic species that was introduced through the aquarium trade. And for many years, it was thought that it would never survive anywhere where it freezes during the winter. But it has, in fact, become established in a pond up in Olathe. And so it can survive a freezing winter. So a really big concern because it can just completely take over a pond. These are two of the knapweeds I was talking about earlier. You can see where spotted got its name, the brown tip brax. Diffuse knapweed, kind of sawtoothed or hair extensions on the brax. Black swallowwort, related to is in the milkweed family. Sold as an ornamental, but will take over. Yellow and Dalmatian toadflax, both of the same genus, but again, very aggressive. I heard of one story. It was introduced in an area. A lady moved from California to Nevada. A friend of hers brought 6 plants over from California as a housewarming present, and that valley is now infested with Dalmatian toadflax. And then tropical soda apple, I believe, is also on the federal list, but again, can really take over an area, and is one you don't really want around, hard to get close to. And with that, if you have any questions now or in the future, yes, ma'am.
Is the multiflora rose considered noxious in Johnson County?
I don't know. You'd have to check with Johnson County Weed Control, and they'll be able to tell you. Yes, ma'am.
Are these on the website? I was looking, the plants.
The plants are each listed on the website under plant protection, weed control, and then the weed program.
Is it, do they have a photograph?
Yeah, they'll have a photograph, and they'll also have the range by county of where the plants are and how abundant they are in each county.
And my neighbor planted purple loosestrife.
Yes,
And she got it from
a nursery.
And he said, "Don't tell anyone." I mean, I knew what it was.
Yeah, yeah. My mother used to grow it in her yard.
But, I mean, it's not illegal.
It's
right?
quarantined,
So what?
so that it's not allowed to be sold, but it's very hard to enforce it on every nursery out there. You can't get
But
to
if
them
somebody
all.
has it in their yard.
Tell them they should get rid of it. I don't know that we can come in there and force them to get rid of it, because it is not, if it was noxious, we could do that, but being just quarantined, I don't think we could,
I've
but
asked them to, and I've given them alternatives.
and like my mother said, well, it's not spreading in my yard. Well, whose yard is it spreading in? Because the birds can collect the seed, the wind can collect the seed and carry it so it spreads where you don't see it. So.
Did I hear where recently that the even the supposedly self-styled cultivars could still be cross-pollinated by other varieties?
Yes, yes. Even if it says it's infertile, doesn't produce seeds, don't buy it if it's one of these plants, because it's quarantined, or loosestrife is quarantined. But like I said, it can revert back into a fertile, away from the cultivar it was raised to, back into its fertile original state.
Any more questions for Scott? Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.